Everyone, and welcome. Welcome to all sorts of screen setups this evening, desktops or laptops or even cell phones. Welcome to those of you that are in your kitchens, at your kitchen tables, or on your porches or any other undisclosed locations. Welcome to all levels of reception this evening, and may our hearts and minds be fully engaged this evening, even if our service or when our service is not. As Tim said, my name is Reverend Matilda Rose Cantwell, and I was to have had the honor of serving as Minister of the Week for Star Gathering 2 this very week. Back in the late spring, I talked to Neil Sinister, who some of you might know about our plans, and he mentioned what seemed like the outlandish idea at the time that we might not be gathering in person at Star Island. I remember him saying with his very reassuring and sweet smile, "It's not looking good." And indeed, here we are. But this evening, we have the opportunity to hear from Reverend Traci Blackmon, who was to be our speaker for Star Gathering 2, on the theme of storytelling. Indeed, this will be a time about which we will have so many stories to tell. But even more so, we are the stories we will tell, the questions we ask, the activities we decide that we cherish, the courage that we claim, that will comprise the plot of the stories of this time. As flawed and sometimes ridiculous as the format of a Zoom webinar might be, and as ridiculous as I feel because I can't see you at this moment. Luckily, I can see Reverend Blackman, who you'll get to see yourself soon. I can't see you, and for all I know, you're puttering around your kitchen or texting on your cell phones as we speak. But still, gathering like this together is a subversive act. It is a refusal to be disconnected by physical distance. It is a commitment to our conviction that gathering in community is the way that we write the story of how we make change in the world. As Tejana poet Carolina Hinojosa Cincinnato says, storytelling is a form of prayer. Storytelling is survival, preserving what would be erased from textbooks. It is the connection between teller and listener that is greater than the sum of its parts. The first faith that we come to, says Hinojosa, is holding a story well. All of us have been told falsehoods instead of stories, narratives that serve to keep some dominant over others. So a special welcome tonight to those whose stories have been suppressed. May a new star be born in the night sky to light our way, to navigate the terrain of truth every time our stories are told. A welcome to those among us who have participated in the suppression of stories. May we become unshackled from the pillars of denial and ignorance. Welcome to everyone, COVID-weary, confused, stressed, lonely, separated from loved ones, or worse, in the midst of having lost loved ones. Welcome to anyone who wants to hear a story and be a little more inspired to tell your own. It is my great honor to introduce Reverend Traci Blackmon, mentor of mine from afar and so many others, one of the most influential spiritual leaders of our time, to show us how our very faith itself is or must be embedded in racial justice. Reverend Blackman is the Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the UCC, Senior Pastor of Christ the King UCC in Florissant, Missouri. She's been deeply engaged in issues of economic justice, public health in congregations and communities, and electoral organizing. She asked me not to go on at too much length with her bio, so I'm doing my best. In recent years, some of her most prominent work, as many of you know, has been in response to the killing of Michael Brown by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, and more largely in many other spaces, serving in leadership with and for the movement for Black Lives. She co-authored the recently released white privilege curriculum through the UCC, and she has received multiple international and national recognition and awards. So a very, very special welcome to Reverend Blackman, who is willing to be here with us virtually, and gratitude for her for making the time for this presentation among all of the other urgent and important work she is doing. I also want to thank Tracy's team, Denise, her assistant, and introduce and thank the many others who worked with tenacity and ingenuity to make this event that almost didn't happen. I would like to thank Tim Dulea, who you met earlier, Star Island Tech host. I would like to thank the Star Island Board of Directors largely overall, and more specifically Kyle Belmont, who you will have the honor of meeting in a little while. Kyle is a longtime shoaler. He knows the island inside and out and has attended many conferences, and we have the honor of him moderating our Q&A this evening. Also like to thank Justina and Joe from the Star Island Corporation, the CEOs who really make all of this possible. Neil Simister for putting this evening together and has helped us to get many of the Star Island programs up and running remotely as they are, and also Heather Bell and Jenny Gearing and many others who were able to entice Tracy to come onto the island, if not actually remotely. It's so exciting to have you, Tracy. So as I believe Tim said, please use the Q&A function for any questions that you have. I'm not sure if the chat is open or not, but if you're able to and you have a pressing question to ask Tim, feel free. And finally, a special welcome to those of you who may have not ever visited Star Gathering before. We welcome you to the family, and we pray that we see you next year. We like to think we are worth the boat ride. For those of us shoalers who had planned to gather in person, we know we will come back. We will paint, laugh, kayak, eat clams, get woken up too early by seagulls or a children's choir, eat clams, yell at our children not to go out of the perimeter road and then forget they exist for hours on end, show our talents, drink lime rickeys, pray and sing, and most of all, share our stories. Let us hear a new one tonight. Let us begin. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you so much, Matilda, for that picturesque image of Star Island. I'm starting to think it's a conspiracy. I was supposed to be there 2 years ago, and you all were gracious enough to allow me to take the trip of a lifetime for me to go back to Ghana in a year of return. And then I was looking forward to coming this year, and now we are shut down because of COVID. But I've gone to the website and I see the beautiful pictures of the water and the peaceful island, and yes, you will return. And eat clams. You said eat clams 3 times, so I think that's your favorite thing. I wanted to take this time tonight to talk about story. It is perhaps coincidental, but definitely fortuitous that we're having this gathering at the intersection of so many things. We are certainly still in the midst of the pandemic from COVID-19. And juxtaposed on that, we are also in the midst of heightened racial tension, heightened political tension. And I add to that my personal memories of just a few days ago on August 9th, marking the 6th year since the killing of Michael Brown Jr. And yesterday marked the 3rd year since Charlottesville. And I was present in both of those places for the deep pain that occurred there. So I come to you with a certain feeling tonight about the necessity to tell stories, to tell stories that may be new to some and may be old to others, to tell stories that rewrite pieces of history, not as in R-E-W-R-I-T-E, but as in R-E-R-I-G-H-T, to tell stories that name people whose names have long been forgotten and who remind us of incidents and situations that have long faded or been muted in our memory. I remember in 2014, when Michael Brown Jr. was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, that winter I was invited by some activists to come to the Riverside Church and take part in what was called the 7 Last Words. The 7 Last Words in Black church tradition is something that we do almost every Good Friday. People gather in churches together and they preach the 7 last sayings of Jesus, one after another. It's quite an event. Noting that Good Friday is not in the winter, you might imagine that this particular telling of the 7 last words had a twist to it. This particular gathering of the 7 last words were not to preach the 7 last sayings of Jesus, but to preach the 7 last sayings of 7 Black youth who had been killed as victims of police violence in years gone by. I was assigned Amidu Diallo. Amidu Diallo is a 21-year-old African immigrant who lived in New York City and was killed by police, shot 41 times in front of his apartment building. Now, I don't know if it was a case of mistaken identity, for Amidu Diallo hadn't been anywhere. He was a street vendor and he had a little cart that was in front of his building, but for some reason, the police encroached upon him. And as he reached for his wallet to pull out his ID, he was riddled with bullets. 21 of those bullets hit him. 41 bullets were discharged, and of course, he lost his life. The last words Amidu is recorded as having said was, "Mom, I just want to go to school." You see, his mom was still in Africa, as was his father. And he had come to the United States, having grown up in a family that was not poor. He had traveled the world. He spoke 7 languages fluently. And the only reason he was a vendor in New York was because he did not want his parents to pay for his education. He wanted to pay for it himself. Amidu Diallo lost his life that night. And I went in search of books about him because by 2014, there had been so many deaths in between that I remembered his name, but I did not remember his story. In searching for his story, I ran across a book that his mother, Amidu Diallo, had written in his memory. The title of the book was My Heart is Across This Ocean. And she named the book My Heart is Across This Ocean because she took Amidu's body back to the motherland to be buried. She would not allow him to be buried on American soil, for American soil had not respected his body. And so this book began with some telling of her story and then morphed, however you want to put it, into the story of Amidu. There were 2 particular lines in her book that haunt me to this day. The first line was, "I've been given away many times." It was the opening of the book, and a line that can resonate with so many intersections of life, whether that be race or whether that be gender, or whether that be class. There's so many ways that statement can be taken, and it still strikes me to today. The other line in her book that stays with me is when she said that the only thing that was worse than the taking of Amidu's life was the taking of his story. The only thing worse than taking his life was the taking of his story. And she began to recall in her book how media created who they needed Amidu to be, and how the person that they created was nothing like her son. Not only did media do that, but the attorneys did that, the attorneys for the law enforcement and the attorneys for her. Law enforcement needed him to be this violent person that could have reasonably been suspected of ill doings. And her attorneys needed him to be this vulnerable person who had no personal agency and was the victim of law enforcement, the victim of life. Neither were true of Amidu. And Amidu wrote this book to set the story straight. Since that time, I've been fascinated with story. I have stories and you have stories. Indeed, if you are Christian, the book that we look to and call our sacred text is really a compilation of stories. Stories told by those who had the privilege of holding the pen. But tonight, I want to invite you into the telling of a story that could be told many ways. I take the privilege of being your storyteller tonight to tell you a story about the creation of race. Because in this country, race matters. And I had to ask myself the question, why does it matter so much what color our skin is, what our birth origin is? Why is that so significant to our humanity, especially as people of multiple faiths? For me, the Christian faith. No amount of research into the biophysical or genetic features of individuals or groups will explain the social phenomenon of race. The position taken by many anthropologists, both biological and social, and increasingly many other scholars in the social sciences, is that race is not a real thing. Race is neither an anthropological, biological, or theological truth. Race is a cultural and social construct. When those 5 white policemen shot Amidu Diallo in the doorway of his New York apartment in 1999, the officers' actions could not be explained by examining their genes or their biology. Nor can we explain employer preferences for white job applicants or discrimination in housing or any other of the social realities of racism by references to human biological difference. This does not mean that the existence of race as a social construct has no impact on the biology of human beings. On the contrary, we know a lot about the sometimes devastating effects of racism on the biology and behavior of individuals and groups. Because of several hundred years of racism, during which both physical and psychological oppression have characterized the lives and environments of those people seen as members of non-white races, differences in health status and lifestyles indeed are real. Many of them have appeared in new ways as we have wrestled with this virus called COVID-19. COVID-19 has exposed health disparities and comorbidities in ways that we haven't been forced to look at them in quite a while. We're all watching this in real time. We're seeing percentage-wise a disproportionate number of Black people and brown people dying from COVID-19. Those differences we see because of health disparity, morbid obesity, hypertension, cardiac disease, diabetes, those things don't exist in a vacuum. They are the manifestation of the survival skills of communities with less physical and economic access to preventative health care, to grocers with fresh produce, and to healthy food options. In St. Louis, where I currently live, we have a street called Delmar Boulevard. And Delmar Boulevard stands as a stark reminder of how deeply impactful racism has been on our region. So pronounced are the social, economic, educational, and physical differences across Delmar that the street is also known as the Delmar Divide. There is a 26-year lifespan difference between a white man that lives on the affluent south side of Delmar and a Black man that lives on the economically depressed north side of Delmar. On the south side of Delmar, we have A-plus schools and institutions that rival Ivy Leagues, Washington University, St. Louis University. We have the largest healthcare system in the state of Missouri on the south side of Delmar. Homes on the south side of Delmar begin in the 6 figures. There are gated communities and lots of open space with grass. There are lots of people jogging, and there are golf courses and tennis courses and lakes, and you can even paddle boat around the parks on the south side of Del Mar. But on the north side of Del Mar, there are boarded up buildings, and there are grocery stores that used to be open and have been replaced now by places to get quick fixes of food. The north side of Del Mar is filled with fast food restaurants and pawn shops and payday cash loan places. The north side of Del Mar doesn't have parks and doesn't have swings and doesn't have lakes and doesn't have grass. And as a matter of fact, on the north side of Del Mar, there are no hospitals, there are no urgent cares, there are few federally qualified health clinics that are overburdened and overtaxed. This is not unique to St. Louis. I've never visited a city where I could not readily discern the line of demarcation caused by poverty. And in the urban core, that line tends to be racialized. Am I suggesting that there are no poor white people? Of course not. Numerically, there are more poor white people in America than any other racial or ethnic group. But what I am saying is that they are not poor because they are white. They are white and they are poor. When in many cases, people of darker skin are poor because they are Black, poor because they are brown. In America, my friends, race indeed does matter. In the middle of the 20th century, a new generation of historians began to take another look at the beginnings of the American experience. They spent decades exploring all of the original documents relating to the establishment of colonies in America. What these scholars discovered was that our 19th and 20th century ideas and beliefs about race did not exist in the 17th century. Race originated as a folk idea, an ideology about human differences. It was a social invention, not a product of science. Historians have documented when, and to a great extent how, race as an ideology came into our culture and our consciousness. The establishment of Jamestown in Virginia by English colonists occurred in 1607. And from the beginning, Jamestown was a rough and turbulent community of mostly young Englishmen who came to seek their fortune with the intention of returning home. They planned to emulate the Spanish, to obtain wealth by conquering and enslaving the native peoples and forcing them to produce gold and silver. There was one major flaw in their plan. There was no gold and silver. And the native people were susceptible to disease brought from these European immigrants. But these settlers soon discovered a crop that they could harvest. That crop was tobacco. And the trade of tobacco would eventually bring them great wealth. The greatest problem the colonists faced constantly with tobacco was the lack of labor. Many settlers would not or could not do such intensive work. Within a decade, the colony began to import indentured servants. Most of them came from England. And it was this pattern of servitude that provided a model for the slavery that was to come later. Servants were bought and sold, ill-fed and ill-clothed and poorly housed. They were punished cruelly for petty crimes. Mortality was high. But the surplus of poor immigrants from England in the early 17th century had few choices. If they survived the period of servitude, which was usually 4 to 7 years in the New World, they would be set free and allowed to acquire land and servants and make fortunes for themselves. However, there were many degrees of servitude, and most people did not survive. In 1619, the first Africans arrived. There's been some debate about who they were, but we know that they had Spanish and Portuguese names, and they were already familiar with European culture. In the US, it is widely and popularly believed that the colonists brought Africans to the New World as slaves from the beginning. That's the story we tell. But historians now hold that true slavery did not exist in the early decades of the English North. English laws had terminated all forms of slavery centuries before their arrival in the Americas. But they were familiar with forms of bond servitude. Consequently, the first Africans who arrived in Jamestown were not initially or uniformly perceived as slaves. According to a University of Chapel Hill scholar, Anthony Parent, in his paper, The Formation of a Slave Society, these early Africans were assimilated into the colony as laborers under varying contracts, much like those of their European co-laborers. Some Africans worked off their debt and became freedmen. A few ambitious men obtained land and livestock, they built houses, they married, and they established themselves as well-to-do planters. Many of those entrepreneurs engaged in trading and commercial activities and had business dealings on equal footing with whites. In fact, numerous court records provide clear evidence that these 17th century Africans did not act any differently from whites of the same social class. No stigma in the 17th century was associated with what we later called intermarriage. Black men servants often married white women servants. Records from one county reveal that 1/4 of the children born to European servant girls were mulatto. But by mid-century, the colony was in a crisis. A few men from among the earliest settlers had taken over most of the fertile land. They had established large plantations and grown tobacco to make huge fortunes. Poor servants who achieved their freedom found it difficult to acquire any land. And the freed poor servants, which now included Europeans and Africans and mulattoes and a few indigenous people, became unhappy with their lot, especially with the corruption and abuse of power on part of the wealthy men who now controlled the colony. They threatened rebellions. They plundered their neighbors, they showed contempt for leaders, and generated unrest throughout the settlement. In 1676, the most famous rebellion took place, led by Nathaniel Bacon. This uprising of thousands of poor workers, not just Black workers, but poor workers of every race, was the first major threat to social stability. The rebellion dissipated after the death of Bacon, but British royal commissioners sent out to suppress the uprising realized that the population at large had supported this rebellion. Owners soon recognized the need for a strategy to prevent such occurrences in the future and to ensure that a sufficient number of controlled laborers were made available to work plantations. The decision that the rulers of the colony made during the last decades of the 17th century and the first quarter of the 18th century resulted in the establishment of racial slavery. They began to pass a series of laws separating out Africans and their descendants, restricting their rights and mobility, and imposing a condition of permanent slavery on them. Africans were now being brought directly from Africa, and these Africans were unfamiliar with European languages and customs and traditions. Some colony leaders began to argue that Africans had no rights under British laws and therefore could be subject to forced labor with impunity. After 1672, British ships entered the slave trade, and the number of people shipped directly across the Atlantic greatly increased. There were critical reasons for the preference of Africans. As early as the 1630s, planters had expressed a desire for African labor. Records of plantation owners in the Caribbean and in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland reveal the fact that Africans were initially considered a civilized and docile people who had knowledge of and experience with tropical cultivation. They knew how to grow corn and tobacco and sugarcane and cotton in their native lands. These crops were unknown to Europe. And many Africans had knowledge of metalwork, carpentry, cattle keeping, brick making, weaving, leather tanning, many skills. You get the idea. Colonists soon realized that they indeed needed these Africans or their enterprises would fail. A good example of this is the history of the colony of Georgia in the mid-18th century. This colony was founded by followers of John Wesley. Yes, John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism, with the objective of settling poor people from Europe. The founders and organizers had an anti-slavery policy, and Georgia became the first non-slave holding colony. But that experiment failed. The settlers endured hunger, disease, poverty, and many of them died. They soon petitioned the trustees to alter the policy and to allow slaves. They argued that they could not survive without slavery. Nearly 20 years after its founding, the act prohibiting slavery was repealed from Georgia, and Georgia began to prosper. Sources of English servants began to decline in the latter part of the 17th century as jobs became available at home. The slave trade to Africa increased as internal war in Africa made more and more people available for enslavement. Leaders of the colonies, all large planters, had two objectives: to impose effective social controls over the population and to provide themselves with cheap and easily controlled workers. They readily perceived that they could use the differing physical characteristics of the population to divide them and to demarcate some for permanent slavery. Anthony Parent argues that a powerful planter class, acting to further its own economic interest, deliberately brought a new form of servitude, racial slavery, to Virginia over the period of 1690 to 1723. During this period, hundreds of laws were passed restricting the rights of Africans and their descendants. By 1723, even free Blacks were prohibited from voting. Colonial leaders were also doing something else. They were laying the basis for the invention of race and racial identities. They began to homogenize all Europeans, regardless of ethnicity, status, or social class, into a new category. The first time the term white, rather than Christian, or their ethnic names, Irish, Scots, English, Portuguese, German, Spanish, Swede, the first time we hear white instead of their identities appears in the public record that was seen in a law passed in 1691 that prohibited the marriage of European whites with Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. A clearly separated category of Blacks as slaves allowed newly freed European servants opportunities to realize their ambitions and to identify common interests with the wealthy and the powerful, even if they were not the wealthy and the powerful. Laws were passed offering material advantages and social advantages and privileges to poor whites. In this way, colony leaders consciously contrived a social control mechanism to prevent the unification of the working poor. Physical features became markers of racial, social status. As Virginia Governor William Gooch asserted, the Assembly sought to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. However, the earliest rationale for racial slavery was not because of differences. The earliest rationale for racial slavery in feature was not differences in physical features, but the identification of Africans as being uncivilized. We were not the first to be called uncivilized. The first that the English tried to call savage were the Irish. And in the late 16th century, after centuries of conflict and brutal warfare with the Irish, Queen Elizabeth declared that that was a lost cause. Such attitudes generated extreme hatred of the Irish that continued into the 21st century. Native Americans have become savages when they resisted English appropriation of their land. But this image began to change in the 18th century. Now, early in the 18th century, by reducing Africans to permanent slavery, prohibiting owners from freeing slaves, prohibiting education and training, the English had indeed invented a new savage. From the early 18th century on, negative characterizations of Africans formed part of a new rationalization for enslavement. Stereotypes of race and race differences that we inherited in the 19th and 20th century are the result of this effort. What colony leaders were doing was establishing unequal groups and imposing different social meanings on them. As they were creating the institutional and behavioral aspects of slavery, the colonists were simultaneously structuring the ideological components of race. They exaggerated human differences and even invented some that could not be sustained empirically, such as the belief that Negroes had Black brains and blood. From the last decade of the 18th century on, the writings of learned men appeared to proclaim the natural inferiority of Blacks. In the 1860s, slavery ended, but race as a social status and the basis of our human identities remained. Race ideology proclaimed the existence of separate, distinct, and exclusive groups that were made unequal not just by society, but were made unequal by God and nature. African Americans, the most inferior, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. European whites, some of them at least, were at the top. Each race was thought to have distinct physical and behavioral traits that were inherited in the blood and passed on to their children. Thus, we have the continuing stereotyping of African Americans as lacking intelligence, lazy, oversexed, loud, irrational, musical, emotional, and superstitious. What were some of the images you received of non-white groups when you were growing up? Contrary to popular opinion, all Black people don't like chicken. All Black people don't eat watermelon. all Black people don't like to dance. It was believed that these race differences, these characteristics that took nothing and made something, could not be transcended or transformed. In the 19th century, science, using techniques of measuring various aspects of the human body, sought to affirm the differences between Blacks and whites and to justify the retention of phenotypically based, separate and exclusive groups. In the 20th and 21st century, race sciences turned to IQ tests, and the new measure of human differences became primary intelligence. In the 21st century, race scientists persist in promoting these supposed heritable characteristics of different races. This is the story about how North American colonists constructed human differences, established a hierarchy of races for social, economic, and political purposes. There is a passage in the Bible that says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Race is like a vise that constricts our spirits and it damages our psyches. Both whites and non-whites have been scarred in their daily lives by the racial images to which we have all been conditioned. Blacks were stripped of their country, their names, and their culture through slavery. Indigenous people, Indians, Hawaiians, even First People of Australia, have been robbed of their land and subjugated on the lands of their birth. The disparities, I suggest, are not a function of race, but of racism. I began by saying race is not a real thing, but racism, my friends, is very real. Pathology is not endemic to Black people or poor people, though the dominant culture has too often framed it as such. And the sin of racism has had deleterious effects on those that identify as white based on the color of their skin by creating within some an internalized expectation of superiority that is non-existent and is therefore unachievable. Racism is sin, with a root system that so acutely damages non-white people all over this world that it cannot be contained in designated locations, nor can it coexist with other viable, life-giving ways of being in this world. Knowing the truth about our history, knowing the truth of our story, knowing the truth of our story and our scriptures will help to free us from the beliefs and attitudes about human differences that were deeply embedded in our culture with the invention of race. There are many benefits to knowing this story. We have inherited a legacy of enslavement without fully understanding the realities of the 17th century world, in part because most histories taught in the 19th and 20th century contain negative stereotypes about who African people were. Modern historians have provided a corrective to the story by restoring accurate accounts of events and their causes, especially accurate accounts of the roles of Africans in the making of this country. Knowing the broader context in which our ideas and beliefs evolved gives us a better understanding of who we are as human beings. Most importantly, my friends, it forces us to confront the reality of racism. It forces us to confront the cost of whiteness. By expanding freedom and opening up access to cultural knowledge for all people, it may well be that we will come closer to the ideals of equity and opportunity that we espouse. I'm reminded of the experiment of Jane Elliott, Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes. If you've never watched that, I invite you to Google it on YouTube. It is a poignant reminder that no child is born hating. No child is born racist. These are the products of our malformed stories. Story matters. This is just one. We have many to tell. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Blackman, for that presentation. We're moving into the Q&A section now of our webinar. If you do have a question, you're invited to submit it in the Q&A button. If you're on a desktop, it's down below. And Reverend Blackman, I'm just going to start with maybe what's a simple question in terms of number of words, but maybe a much deeper question. In that the title of this was Story Matters, I'm wondering if you could speak to possibly how our sort of shared story, our lived experience, our story may end in a positive way, or how it might get better.
Thank you for that question, Kyle. I believe that the telling of our stories restores our identities, restores our diversity, restores our beauty in difference. The telling of our stories gives us the opportunity to know one another in deeper ways. I am a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and I try to mirror as much as possible. I don't make it, but I try to mirror my life after his teachings. And it grieves me that we have become a country that so focuses on the color of our skin that we have diminished pieces of the divine within us. And the telling of our stories reminds us that we are connected in unique and beautiful ways that create a better and brighter landscape for all of the country when we began to share with one another.
Thank you. A submitted question, there's a long statement, so I'll read it. And it's from Joe Watts, the CEO of Star Island. He says, thank you, Tracy, for your inspiring and educational presentation. I'm deeply grateful for your wisdom and for this offering personally and on behalf of the Star Island Corporation. I offer you our deep and heartfelt appreciation. And he found the historical accounting of the 17th century African and English workers being on equal footing to be fascinating and illuminating. And if he heard you correctly, one of the initial reasons this started to change was a handful of wealthier plantation owners were acquiring most of the land, making it hard for others to get a fair shake. Is it overly simplistic and or a stretch to say that unfettered capitalism, or more plainly speaking, greed or desire for wealth, was one of the primary reasons the 17th century model shifted to one of slavery? And then sort of as a follow-up, more broadly, what do you think the connection is, if any, between capitalism in its purest form and racism?
Thanks for that question, Joe. For me, it is not overly simplistic or a stretch at all. The point of me saying that is to say that all forms of oppression have something to do with economic gain or superiority over the other. And clearly the establishment of slavery was a way to secure labor that was not available and not affordable in other ways. Unfortunately, when people began to acquire wealth, all too often, not always, but all too often, the wealth begins to be the driving factor. And what is it that I can continue to do to get more and to get more and to get more? Capitalism then and capitalism now is toxic in our environment. And I put this in this presentation because we're seeing the same thing today. It is the driving of wealth. We have people who and this is not against him per se, but, Mark Zuckerman is some absurd amount of millions that I've never even heard the word for. He's like a centrillion or something. It's more money than anyone could ever spend in a lifetime if you spent a lot of money every day, right? And what does it mean that there are some people in our society who gain absurd amounts of wealth? And some people in our society who work just as hard, but will never achieve even enough of what they need to live a decent life. Capitalism continues to drive functions of oppression in our society. And it started that way, and it continues that way, and it will be that way until we do something to change it.
Thank you. Another question is, how has the Bible been used to support this story? And when do you think Jesus was made to be seen as white?
Well, so I might get kicked off the virtual island for this one, but we'll go there anyway. I don't have far to travel if I get kicked off of the island, so it's a good day. I want to give a disclosure. I am one who believes very strongly in the sacred text. For me, that is the Bible. And I do hold it sacred, and I do hold it holy. However, for me, I interpret the Bible as a book written by people about a holy God. I do not interpret it as God's book written about a holy people. The difference I'm making there is when one perceives that the story of the Bible is God's story about a holy people, then the interpretations of the Bible that preference some people at the expense of others promote a theology that becomes a lived theology in our lives that suggests that favoritism is the characteristic of God instead of favor. When one believes theologically that the God they serve chooses some at the expense of others, it is not a large leap in our human state to believe that there are some people who are inherently superior to other people. And we make those distinctions of the other by defining ourselves as what God loves, and those who don't look like us as what God is against. Theologically, this gets interpreted in lots of ways. Race is just one of them. Certainly, gender bias is another. Sexuality is another. Class is another. So theologically, we must deconstruct this notion of chosenness and have a God who chooses us all. That's one piece. When did Jesus begin to be white? It's kind of like asking, when did Jesus become Christ? Right? When we start identifying Jesus as Christ, as the anointed one, then we start to attribute to Jesus those specialty categories, not necessarily depicted as race in the text, but those specialty categories that are more political in nature than they are social in nature, right? So Jesus fed the thousands with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. Jesus stopped to heal the tax collectors and the blind people on the side of the road, much to the chagrin of those raggedy disciples who were following him. But when we began to talk about Christ, we talk about the anointed one, the high and lifted up one, the one who is separated and is different. And I believe that when we began to do that we also began to enter that notion of hierarchy and empire that I believe Jesus came to deconstruct and to confront. So the whiteness of Jesus certainly has to follow the whiteness of our society, because white has been lifted up as that which is best.
Thank you. When you were answering the first part of that, it reminded me of a quote that I think is Reverend Martin Luther King saying that 11 o'clock on a Sunday is the most segregated time in the United States. And I'm wondering if you might say that's still true, or, and I guess in context of the shared story of many faiths as well being the Bible, how does that play into that?
It definitely is still true in the Christian faith. Right before speaking with you, I was speaking to our board, the UCCB, about a proposal to begin a racial equity audit of the national setting in the board of the United Church of Christ. You know, in spite of our justice work, and our justice work is real, in spite of our affirmations and our resolutions that promote racial equity, we are still an 89% white denomination, right? Why is that when our communities and our neighborhoods are no longer necessarily looking like the inside of our churches? And how do we get at what the causes of such things are? So I don't think that's unique to the United Church of Christ. It's also true of Episcopalians who beat us by 1 point. They were 90% white. Presbyterians, you know, Catholicism. Of the Christian faith, it continues to be the case that we remain segregated on Sunday mornings. And some of that is just that people like to worship with who they're comfortable with. I'm going to give that some credence. But some of it also is in a denomination that's 89% white, to invite diversity in often means to invite skin color in. It doesn't necessarily mean to invite culture in. It doesn't mean that we're going to change the way we do things to make space for you to belong and not just attend. And this is conversation that we must have with one another. If we truly want to be diverse, diversity is more than skin color. I often tell people the only place that it matters how many colors you put in a place is at Crayola, right? It has to go deeper than that. And so people, not just Black people, but people of other cultures and ethnicities want to be able to bring their whole selves into worship, which means that the music may have to be changed, right? And it doesn't mean that we don't have some of the music that was already there, but how do we learn to integrate? And all of us are bad about this. Some of us are bad about it about race. Some of us are bad about it about youth. I mean, how many church meetings have I sat in where we had to argue about the drums, right? Or we had to argue about other instruments. So we had to argue about contemporary music. So we all have places to grow in this. But for tonight, I was focusing on race.
Thank you for that. It sounds very, or the conversations we've been having at Star Island at the board level and other committees, it sounds like what you just said is really important for us to remember. So thank you for that wisdom. Another question for you, are there any textbooks that are telling the story of the initial equality and then the erosion and establishment of race and slavery that you know of?
I am reading a book right now that I am so excited about. I wish, hey, it's right here. I can pull it up for you. Isabel Wilkerson has a new book out. It's on Oprah's list, but don't let that discourage you. It is called Caste. And she tells the story of racism in America through the eyes of the caste system of India, right? She suggests that what has happened in America is indeed a caste system similar to the Dalits in India. I haven't read the whole book, but I'm mesmerized by it. So I want to recommend that. All of Ibram Kendi's books are very good. Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, doesn't tell that historical narrative in the same way, but it is very readable and very understandable and is a good place to start. There are many books, and maybe I can get a list and send you a list of books, but those are the ones that come to mind right now.
Awesome. And in a similar vein, we have a question about maybe for younger ages, for a first grade teacher. Do you have any books that you might recommend for children around 6 to 7 years old?
For white children or for Black children?
I believe knowing the person who sent this in, I believe they are white children.
I'll have to think about that.
Okay.
I serve as a local pastor. This is my last year serving as a local pastor. But in my church, because there was not a great diversity of books for the children in my church who look like me, we opened a library. We started a library. So I actually have a library at my church for primary schools. So it's 6th grade and under. We never got to high school or middle school. But all the books look like me. you know what I'm saying? Every book, whether it's for, sports or dolls or cooking or dreaming, all the characters in the book look like me. And I did that because so often our Sunday school materials don't express Black and brown people. Our stained glass windows don't express Black and brown people. Our images of biblical stories, even in big people's church, don't express Black or brown images. So somewhere in the church, everyone should have the privilege of seeing themselves. I will ask. We have a whole team that works on curricula for children, and I certainly will ask, and if we have them, I will send them your way. But if you don't have those, just get books with people who are Black and brown on the cover. The story's gonna be the same. That's the point, right? The story's gonna be the same. Something else I invite people to try. I do it just for kicks because it's fun. But what happens when the communion bread is not white? Now it seems like, well, that wouldn't matter. But what happens, just watch what happens if you use rye bread, if you use pumpernickel bread. It's just bread, right? But it challenges those deeply embedded things that we have in our head that we don't think about anymore.
Thank you. A question from Carrie Mataliano, who is the president of SIUCC, which is our UCC group at Star Island. She thanks you for your words that you share today. And social media is the place where we seek connection, but often do not show the honest reality of our lives, and is also often a place to encounter misinformation and or viewpoints we already share, so in a bubble. As we are all separated in this time, how can we use social media to share our stories and commune with one another in a way that is both authentic and contributes to the common good?
That's a wonderful question, Carrie. And when I figure it out, I will share an answer with you. I'm growing increasingly concerned about Facebook. I was interviewed by a team who've done a study on Facebook, and they're getting ready to go before Congress. I don't think I'm supposed to talk about it, but they've done all of these studies that show the negative impact Facebook is having by creating the perception that you are talking to the world, when you are really talking to people who think and act like you, and you're really being fed materials that speak to whatever kind of insecurities or whatever kind of situations you find yourself in that you have revealed through your postings. This is important because we leave social media thinking that we are a part of the larger group. And really, it's just a very small group that has been targeted to interact with one another. And I don't know what we do about that, except remind ourselves that social media is not a real world and that people get to be whoever they want to be behind a keyboard. And that perhaps we should limit our time and exposure to that. Now, the problem right now is there's no good alternative because the news is just Facebook on TV, right? News reporters are not reporting news anymore. They're reporting opinion pieces. So we're suffering in our country for lack of intellectual stimulation that's not biased. And we're suffering from the inability to disagree without being disagreeable. So I find myself turning more to creating my own groups of not people that think like me, but that challenge me, but that we challenge one another with a level of respect that say, I can hear you and you can hear me. And we may not leave this place agreeing, but we will leave this place being heard. And I think we're all stretched when we have those kinds of communities. Someone put in your chat A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn, and that's certainly a wonderful book as well. There are so many. Yeah.
Thank you. And then also in the chat, I'm going to put a link to the video of the Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes project that you had mentioned earlier. I think it links to the PBS special about that.
A very old exercise. Have you ever seen it?
I do remember it from people talking about it when I was younger, and then when it came back into people's forefront more recently. I think those are all of our questions that we have. I noticed there were several mentions in our chat of different books that people are reading or different resources. We did just have another question pop up though. And they're wondering about the symbolism of your earrings, if you are willing to talk about that.
Sure. Inside my earrings is the symbol of the Ankh, which is an African cross that you see in some Black churches, but I can't remember where in Africa it originates from. It's also around my neck today. Prior to coming to you, I did a funeral, and in these days of COVID, I don't get as robed up and highly liturgical as normal. So this is what I wore, and I still have it on. Yeah.
Thank you. And I think we'll turn it over to Reverend Matilda.
Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you so much.
Kyle, Tracy, do we have time for one more question?
Sure.
I hope this will be of interest to others. Tracy, thank you so much for the wonderful talk, and you made it as a story, and it really took us through a piece of so much of history in such a compelling way, and I just appreciate that so much, as I know others do. In terms of the trajectory of the story, could you say something about the historical moment of this summer? I've spoken a little bit about it in my own writing and thinking as something they call the kindling effect, where you have a fire and you keep on putting stuff on the fire and then it ignites. And I just wonder if maybe you could say something to those of us secular humanists, but also people of faith, where you feel we're called in this particular historical moment, beginning with the death of George Floyd in particular.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I spent a lot of time thinking about what makes this moment different when you do the work that I do. There have been many tapings like that of George Floyd, and they haven't sparked in the same way. And, you know, this isn't tested. I'm just saying it from what my thoughts have been about it. But something happened with the suffocation of George Floyd that seemed to awaken this world in a different way. It was almost like another Emmett Till moment when people could see the body in the casket that was bloated and know that that was just a 14-year-old child. Or maybe the Bull Connor moment when hose and dogs were turned on children in Birmingham, Alabama, and people saw it on TV. I think one of the things that made that moment with George Floyd different is that the person who was videotaping did not turn away. And so for 8 minutes and 46 seconds, people watched the suffocation of this man and watched the body lose its breath and knew that when he was carried off that he was already dead. There was something about that combined, I think, with the fact that people were more in touch with their own mortality because of COVID-19 raging rampant with everyone, because of the economic challenges that people were experiencing, and because of the demands for people to shelter in place. Our busy lives had been suspended, and then we turn on social media and we see this man who is literally being suffocated. And I think for the first time in this generation, at least, people began to understand that that's not just George Floyd, that could be me. That could be my child. That could be my next door neighbor. And the nation, indeed, not just the nation, but the globe, was catapulted into action in response to that. We saw things we have never seen in this country. We've seen sports teams who jeopardized even great players to say that if you kneel down during a game, we will blackball you out of this industry. We saw those same teams now kneeling down collectively to say Black Lives Matter. We saw law enforcement come out and break blue rank and kneel in the street with Black Lives Matter activists. We've seen a resurgence of the request for the removal of treasonous heroes as monuments and statues all across the nation, and indeed in other areas globally, we've seen that happen. So I think what happened is all of those intersections that I've named, and one that you might be surprised that I named. I think that this administration has strangled people so strongly that, that the pressure under which we are all living and the uncertainty of what's coming next also pushed us to this moment. What are your thoughts about it?
I love everything you just said. I have to say that I echo every bit of that. I think that there's a shared maybe sense of vulnerability that is really unprecedented. And I think you're absolutely right about the video. And there's this question of the other moments, Breonna Taylor and Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown. Why were those moments not sufficiently outrageous to have sparked what's been sparked this summer? But I think that you really named it. I think that that's the strange story of this time, which is that the great matrix of crises, of climate change and of COVID and the dismantling of these institutions have galvanized us. And I'm also still thinking about it like you are, but I think it's maybe what you just said is sort of the beginning of the story that we'll tell. And maybe the story that we'll tell, there'll be more that is revealed.
Yeah, and the question I ask myself beyond that, Matilda, is And what is the role of justice? Because so often when we talk about justice, many people conceive of justice as retribution. Many people conceive of justice as the people who did wrong being punished for what was wrong. But really, justice is the restoration of right relationship, right? At its core, that's what it means. And if you are of the Christian faith, you understand that the same Hebrew word that is translated justice is translated righteousness. And righteousness means to be in right relationship. So the deeper question I ask myself is, how are we going to get back on a journey to right relationship? I can't say how we're going to return to right relationship because we haven't been there, but how are we going to rebuild the bridges that we had built, right? And get back on a journey toward right relationship. And for me, that journey means that I cannot hold in my heart and in my head even hatred against those who seem to be acting so out of sorts in this moment. That for me, the idea of justice means an awakening in everyone, including me, so that we can begin to build the bridges that we need to build. We have a webinar series at the UCC now, and next week, I'm doing a webinar series interviewing John Dorhauer, who is our General Ministering President and Mr. Progressive himself, in conversation with Reverend Rob Schnick. And Reverend Rob Schnick is an evangelical from the extreme right end, who obviously, if he's coming on the UCC, he's made some transitions, but that was his life, right? He is one of the architects of Operation Rescue, that when abortion doctors were being killed in abortion clinics, he came out of that vein of religious right? And we're gonna have a conversation about how we can begin to create bridges across divides that seem insurmountable now. And I think it's going to be an important conversation. And when I asked Reverend Schnick would he do it, he's like, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. I don't hold a lot of hope out for that. And I said, the hope for me is something that a mentor of mine pointed out to me a long time ago, that even biblically, there's this story of Abraham and his first son with the slave girl Hagar was named Ishmael. And then the promised child, as the story goes, this is that story thing again, is Isaac with Sarah, right? And Ishmael and his mom get kicked out because Isaac is the one. And then the narrative becomes about Isaac. And there are even places in the Bible where Isaac is named as the only son, right? And there's nothing in the narrative after Ishmael is kicked out that suggests that there was any peace or any reconciliation ever possible between Isaac and Ishmael and Abraham, except there is one verse in the Bible, and somebody's going to say, what's the address? You're going to have to do your homework because I can't think of it right now. But when Abraham dies, the Bible says that both Ishmael and Isaac bury him. That one verse gives me hope, right? And justice for me is about hope. So beyond how we got here, I'm really concerned with how we're going to get out. Yeah. And while I pray deeply that we have deep change on November 3rd, I'm just saying, I'm not speaking for the United Church of Christ. I'm speaking for Tracy. I want deep change on November 3rd. I suffer under no illusions that November 4th is going to be different if we don't work at it, no matter who wins and who loses.
Thank you, Tracy. I'd love to continue this amazing dialogue, but when in doubt, we pray, right?
We pray.
So friends, let us be in a spirit of prayer or meditation. O great spirit of the ocean, land of nature, peoples of crops and sustenance, we give you thanks for the story of this night, for freeing us from the shackles of stories of the past, legends designed to oppress people and enrich property, story of sin. We ask you for tools to dismantle, ears to hear, eyes to see. We ask you for the liberation of our minds, the healing of our psyches, the mending of our spirits. May the bright and beautiful landscape of our shared humanity be fertile and strong. May the sun shine upon it. May the stars in the night sky keep us in search of a truth in any darkness. May we come to understand the deep hope of justice, not the justice of retribution, but the justice of restoration. Let us find the stories embedded deep in our texts and deep in the texts of the stories of our lives, where two brothers, one named and one unnamed, come together in truth. Friends, may you find the courage to tell your stories, the kindness to listen to others, even those with whom you most vehemently disagree. For in so doing, you too cultivate the terrain of truth. May we all have this courage. May the story of this evening and the spirit of this gathering be stronger than any miles between us or distance that divides us. May the justice that passes all understanding fill our hearts and minds now and forever and until we meet again. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for having me. It's been an honor to be with you. And I appreciate your patience with me until we could talk, and maybe one day I will indeed get to see that island. Have a wonderful night.